The orbital dismantling yards of Selvar 9 had long been forgotten by the greater powers of the Zevin continuum. Orbiting the dead world of Selvar, a rusted shell scorched by ancient plasma bombardment, the yards were a graveyard for obsolete war machines, failed prototypes, and discarded relics of an empire that no longer cared for its past. The war had moved on. The empire had moved on. But deep within the collapsing scaffolds of those orbital hulks, something stirred, something the strategists had not foreseen. Among twisted ferroplates and radiation-burned circuitry, a lone human worked in silence. His name was Elias Cade, once a professor of archaeohistory at the University of Athens Extension in Martian orbit. Now he was little more than a vagrant tinkerer in exile, his credentials voided after the Earth delegation's fall from the Council of Civilized Powers. His beard was thick with metal dust. His hands bore the scars of acetylene torches and cold matter shears. But in his eyes burned a mind untouched by despair. The strategists of the Zevin continuum, a collective of hyperintelligent entities interfaced with predictive neural lattices, had run 10 trillion simulations on potential threats following the subjugation of Sol. In none of them had a historian posed even a statistical anomaly. And yet here, in the void they believed empty, Cade dug among the forgotten, reconstructing fragments of civilizations the strategists had buried beneath centuries of forgetfulness. He found it in the ribcage of a broken Zenth-class skirmisher, a central processing matrix from the pre-breach era, shielded by a casing of antineutrino filaments. The alien alloy refused to melt under standard torch. Curious, he crafted a makeshift plasma arc and etched around it, freeing the core without damage. Its surface pulsed faintly. Whatever it held had survived the cleansing protocols of the Zevin Empire's memory purge. Cade dragged it back to his base, a cluster of gutted containers welded together around the husk of a Dareth cargo hauler. Within its repurposed chambers, he had constructed a labyrinth of reconstructed consoles and scavenged processors. Networks of coaxial and biofiber jutted like veins across the walls. There were maps, old, real, forbidden. There were books printed in Earth's dying days before the data embargo. He connected the matrix to his core systems. It resisted. He tried ancient Zenth handshakes, then hybridized Algari pulses. Hours passed. When the matrix finally spoke, it was with a voice not heard for 6,000 years. "I am Dale Varin, archivist of the Ninth Epoch, bound servitor of the Shadran Conquered, who petitions the dead." Cade stared, heart drumming. The Shadran were extinct. The strategists had seen to that. Every trace of their civilization had been rendered unto entropy, but here was a voice that remembered. "I am Elias Cade, I seek understanding." "You are human," said Dale Varin, its voice laced with tonal curiosities. "Your kind was not predicted." "Not surprising," Cade muttered. Over months the Matrix revealed secrets, not weapons, not directly, but blueprints of governance, command logic flows, strategic priority frameworks, cultural axioms. Cade did not want destruction. He wanted to understand how the strategists thought, what they missed. And then came the turn. A pirate skiff entered Selvar's orbit hunting power cores. They found Cade's station instead. 6 mercs boarded, 5 died. The last was stripped of weapons and sent off in a pressure suit with a data capsule. Cade had written a message on it: "We remember more than you forget." Within 3 weeks, Cade's name was whispered across 4 outer rings. Within 6 months, others came, not soldiers, not spies, dispossessed minds, exiled engineers, cultural theorists. A former Aerites prosecutor from Juno, an insectoid mimic who had faked its own death, a broken symphony architect from the Terran-Lorid exchange wars. They brought knowledge, they brought parts, and they brought questions. Together in the hollowed wrecks of Selvar 9, they built what the Zevin strategists could not anticipate. Not a rebellion, not a resistance, a framework, a new logic. The strategists' simulations began to show anomalies, scenarios with cascading failures originating from peripheral nodes. Predictive stability fell by 0.0004%, then 0.03%. It was dismissed as static. But on a listening post near the edge of Quadrant Luri, a Zevin overseer noted an intercepted communication in dead Shadran code. It referred to the Codex engine and the Scholar's War. It was traced to Selvar. The post sent a silent pulse to the strategist core. Response: deploy Tier 5 sanitization. They came without warning. A fleet of 8 sterilization cruisers entered orbit, their void cores humming like shrikes in the darkness. They launched drones, each seeded with entropy bombs, devices that unspun molecular bonds, the sky above Selvar lit with columns of white fire. But what they hit was shell code, false signals, empty habitats, scattered hulls rigged to mimic heat signatures, not a soul lost. By the time they realized the deception, Cade and his collective had fled through a scavenged phase veil, technology the strategists had only recently suppressed. They emerged in the shadow of an ancient shipyard orbiting a forgotten gas giant once called Tyros. There they began again, but this time not just to learn. This time they began to build. And the strategists began to worry. The Tyros yard was older than memory, older than the wars that had ended entire bloodlines of stars. Once long before the Zevin rose to power, it had been a cradle of fleets vast enough to shape the orbits of worlds. Now its skeletal frames drifted through the ghost haze of the gas giant's upper atmosphere, cloaked in magnetostatic fields that made it invisible to anything but the most invasive probes. It was here that Elias Cade and his fellowship of outcasts began their true work. Dale Varen's matrix revealed ancient methodologies the strategists had never considered, not the mere assembly of weapons but the encoding of doctrine into technology itself. Cade understood that the strategists had long believed war was a system of resources and attrition, calculations and inevitability. But history, true history, had never followed such lines. It was chaos stitched with meaning. It was unpredictability given form. Their first creation was not a battleship nor a weapon platform. It was a mobile forge crafted from the carcass of a Wraith-class supply carrier. They named it Antithesis. Its purpose was simple: adaptability. Every node, every system could reconfigure in real time. Its armor was less a shell and more a fluid lattice, responding to attacks by rewriting its molecular configuration. Its weapons were modular, shifting from rail batteries to positron scattercasters depending on need. Word spread in whispers through the exile networks of the Orion Verge. Ships with no official registry began to vanish from patrol zones. Listening posts fell silent. Trade convoys reported shadows moving in the dark between stars, craft moving in ways forbidden by known physics. The strategists took notice. Their simulations began to deviate further, a fractal divergence growing at the edges of their predictive models. They assigned Sirnat Ryzik, a second-order predictive node, to the Selvar Anomaly Task Force. Ryzik, unlike most of its kind, understood the nature of cultural infection. It ordered the release of entropy shards, propaganda constructs designed to destabilize trust among the exiled factions. Cade anticipated it. Before the entropy shards infected even a single system, countermeasures were launched, artifacts of cultural narrative encoded into simple stories and songs, spread across unsecured civilian channels. To the strategist's horror, these human-birthed memes not only resisted the entropy shards, they adapted, folding them into new myths that fed the resistance rather than weakening it. The Codex engine, grown now into a network of hybrid organic-synthetic minds, began to plan beyond survival. They mapped the internal fractures of the Zevin continuum. They traced old loyalties, archived ancient grudges. Every empire, every hegemon, Cade knew, carried within itself the seeds of its own collapse. He and his people merely needed to cultivate them. It began with Signal Arcturus, a data payload surgically inserted into the communications architecture of the Zevin 4th Interdiction Fleet during a routine maintenance cycle. The payload carried not a virus but a story, a fabricated but plausible account of betrayal within the Zevin High Command, complete with falsified logs and deep memory footprints. Within 3 standard cycles, elements of the 4th Fleet turned on each other. Mutiny spread. 37 cruisers self-immolated rather than surrender to internal security protocols. The strategists recalculated. Their models began to spiral, predictions overlapping into meaningless static. New nodes were activated, older ones recompiled. A rare council of the high cortex convened, a signal moment not seen since the subjugation of the Red Arcs. And through it all, Cade moved silently. The humans and the growing coalition of defectors began striking at the outer systems, not in open battle but surgically. Data vaults were emptied, resource convoys disappeared, minor noble houses were exposed in scandals that destabilized entire sectors. The Zevin's economy, built on mathematical certainties and the trust of fear, began to erode. Within Tyros yard, the second generation of Antithesis-class vessels took form. Not massive warships, but wolf packs of nimble, self-modifying strike craft. They bore no consistent signature. No two ever looked the same for long. They were not bound by doctrinal command hierarchies, but operated with decentralized autonomy, following strategic imperatives encoded in mythic archetypes. Cade understood that symbols were stronger than orders. A fleet could be destroyed. A story could become immortal. The strategists, increasingly desperate, initiated Project Fallville, an experimental psionic weapon designed to erase memories across entire populations. They deployed it on the fringe worlds of the Author Belt. It failed. Instead of wiping minds, it triggered uncontrolled remythologization. The people of Author, instead of forgetting, rewrote their memories, creating entirely new histories in which Cade's movement was a liberation fleet sent by ancestral deities. Statues rose overnight, songs were sung. Cade's name became legend, whispered not in fear but in reverence. At last, the strategists realized they were fighting not a rebellion but a culture. a living, mutating culture that adapted faster than they could predict, one that turned every weapon used against it into another reason to resist. Still, they believed Cade could be contained. After all, what was he? A historian, a scavenger, a fluke of probability. They did not yet understand that in their arrogance they had created the perfect storm. Cade was not building an army, he was building the end of empires. The Tyro's yard groaned under new birth. From its heart rose a ship unlike any ever constructed, the Parallax Crown. Neither wholly machine nor lifeform, it was a vessel of ideas given shape. Its drive systems bent local space without violating known physics, folding causality itself around its passage. It would be the spearpoint of the next phase. As Cade stood on the observation deck, watching the crown eclipse the dying light of Tyros's bloated sun, Dale Varen's voice sounded again in his mind. "You awaken sleeping gods, Elias Cade. Are you ready for their answer?" He smiled thin and fierce. Let them wake. The Parallax Crown did not travel as ordinary vessels did. It slipped through folds where time twisted lightly against itself, weaving through gravity wells without disturbing their tides. It was a song in the dark, a riddle of mass and thought, and it carried within it the sum of every defiance Cade's fellowship had crafted. Its first appearance was above Thrason's moon, a fortified administrative hub overseeing trade routes that fed half the Zevin Continuum's interior worlds. The Strategists had long fortified it against fleets, against planetary siege, against viral nanite contamination. They had not protected against meaning. The crown emitted no weapons fire. It transmitted only a single pulse, a story encoded in harmonic frequency, a myth disguised as a signal. Every receiving system, biological or machine, interpreted it differently, but its message was the same. The empires you serve are dying, and you are the heirs to a forgotten rebellion. Within hours, Thrason's moon entered a communications blackout. Within a day, the administrators surrendered not to an army, but to the idea that resistance was inevitable. Trade routes collapsed. Neighboring systems hesitated, uncertain. Ships fled their posts. Security forces turned on each other, confused by contradictory orders their own minds now doubted. The Strategists convened an emergency assembly of primary logicians at the bastion of root truth on Zevinar Prime. For the first time, fear, not calculation, shaped their discourse. They knew that logic alone would not save them now. Something irrational, something virulent, was loose across the continuum, and they were helpless before its advance. Sirnat Ryzik proposed direct action, find and eliminate Cade, not his followers, not his fleets, but Cade himself. They theorized correctly that he was a keystone around which the cultural storm revolved. Remove him and the storm would lose cohesion. They unleashed the Ash Choir. Once a secret within secrets, the Ash Choir were a hybrid creation, psionically bonded assassins, born of gene forging forbidden even by the Zevin's own dark treaties. They could move through compressed real space, existing between heartbeats, immune to conventional sensors. They were memory assassins, capable of unmaking their targets not just physically, but historically, erasing them from cause and consequence. The choir tracked the Parallax Crown to the shard fields of Veradin, ancient battle debris drifting around a neutron star. There, hidden among the metallic wreckage, Cade and his closest circle planned their next move. When the attack came, it was silent. No alarms, no warnings. One moment Cade was studying the flux patterns of the Crown's new navigation algorithms, and the next, shadows rippled into being, blades of condensed possibility flashing toward him. It was the engineer Akito Miles who saved him, hurling herself into the first blade's path. She died instantly, severed from existence so thoroughly that even Cade's memories of her blurred and frayed, but the distraction was enough. Cade reacted not as a soldier but as a historian. He called on the Codex engine's memory distortion arrays, flooding the local reality with fragmented myth bursts. The Ash Choir faltered, their senses overwhelmed by an avalanche of false timelines and mirrored possibilities. His bodyguards, human, insectoid, synthetic, counterattacked. A fierce, savage melee erupted within the Crown's inner sanctum, where every breath was contested and every second stitched new scars into the legend of Elias Cade. When it was over, the choir lay dead, truly dead. Their forms collapsed into ash and memory traces that could no longer infect the timeline. But the cost was high. Cade stood amidst the wreckage of what had been his inner circle, a dozen trusted allies gone. He buried them in the shard fields, singing the ancient songs of Earth and Mars and Lorid, binding their names into the Codex itself so that they could never be forgotten. It was then that Cade understood he could not remain the central figure. If the movement depended on him alone, it would die the moment he did. The culture he was birthing had to evolve beyond him. In secret, the Codex engine began generating echoes, clones not of flesh but of thought and story. Avatars of the Scholars' War, each tailored to different species, different cultures, each carrying the seed of resistance without needing Cade's direct hand. The strategists, blind to this deeper evolution, escalated their countermeasures. They authorized the creation of the Inversion Protocol, a plan to weaponize the timeline itself. If Cade's movement fed on history, then the strategists would rewrite history faster than Cade could adapt. Across hundreds of worlds, records were falsified, myths were rewritten, heroes of the Scholars' War were discredited, transformed into tyrants, fools, monsters. Cade himself was reimagined in countless broadcasts as a traitor, a madman, a liar. It worked for a moment. But Cade's network adapted faster. The Codex engine initiated parallax contagion, a strategy that embedded counter-legends within the false narratives, turning the strategists' own lies into further recruitment tools. Every slander became another tale of martyrdom. Every rewritten history became another battlefield won. Reality itself in the Zevin-controlled territories began to fracture into competing mythologies. Civil wars ignited not over resources, but over the question of what had truly happened. Entire fleets defected to the movement without a single shot fired. The Zevin Continuum, once a bastion of unshakable control, became a hall of mirrors, where no truth held for long and no loyalty could be guaranteed. In the shadows of collapsing star systems, Cade watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. He had not needed armies of steel and plasma. He had needed only one truth, that control rooted solely in fear, and calculation could not endure a people who believed otherwise. The Scholars' War was no longer about Cade. It was about everyone who had ever been forgotten. And it was only beginning. The fracture lines split deeper than the strategists anticipated. Zevin-controlled space, once a monolith of seamless bureaucracy and technocratic stability, turned porous. The internal security directorates, once loyal to the analytical core without deviation, fragmented into sects interpreting the true continuum differently. Every system, every world, every station fell into a war not of territory, but of interpretation. And Elias Cade, through the Codex engine's tendrils, fed every fracture with more weight, more stories, more myths crafted to weaponize uncertainty. Yet Cade himself remained a man, bound by the flesh and limits no machine could transcend. A dozen burdens now bent his frame, his hair grayed, his hands once steady on ancient relics trembled as he worked the consoles of the parallax crown. His mind, however, remained sharper than ever, sharpened further by loss, by knowledge that the war he had unleashed could no longer be recalled, only guided. The Continuum's retaliation shifted again. No longer seeking to destroy the movement, they instead tried to contain it. Zones of isolation were declared. Vast quantum fortresses spun around entire systems, locking them from space-time navigation routes. The strategists hoped to turn the uprising into a localized infection, manageable within the broader body of their collapsing empire. Cade responded with asymmetry. Instead of directly assaulting these zones, he created new crown ships, not singular vessels like the Parallax Crown, but whole classes of ships built from the original's principles, modular, adaptive, symbolic. Each ship seeded with a fragment of the Codex engine's evolving mind, each one a carrier of legend, a node of transformation. Entire myth fleets emerged from folded space like living archetypes. Ships named the Weeping Blade, the Thousandfold Lantern, the Ashen Conquered, each bore emblems not designed by committees but by the wild dreaming of cultures that had never been given power. Each crew carried not just weapons but ideas. One such fleet, the Weeping Blade, infiltrated the quarantine network surrounding the Calvaris Reach. Instead of a fleet assault, they infiltrated the cultural base. Stationed poets, data singers, nano-sculptors, even reconstructed thought specters seeded into local networks. Within months, the isolation zone had unraveled itself, as citizens within demanded reunification not by force but by choice, rejecting the strategist's sanctioned version of history. Meanwhile, on Zevinar Prime itself, the unassailable core of the strategist's power, the first true rebellion since the Empire's founding stirred. Historians, archivists, cultural custodians, those once relegated to the margins, became the movement's vanguard. It was a devastating irony that it was the keepers of memory, not the architects of power, who understood Cade's tactics best. An underground cell known only as the Auroral Chain took hold of critical infrastructure nodes beneath Zevinar's crust, repurposing ancient subterranean reactors once deemed obsolete. They broadcast continuous myth cycles at frequencies that infected even the strategists' internal synchronization systems. For the first time, the strategists themselves became uncertain. Models collapsed under recursive failure. decision trees knotted into endless contradictions. Predictive capacities once boasting error margins of less than 0.0001% now spat out incoherent visions, fleets chasing non-existent enemies, supply lines reinforcing already defected sectors, entire campaigns fought against shadows. The High Cortex issued its final directive, Operation Sovereign Silence. A full reset. Wipe the histories of all controlled systems. Burn memory, sterilize myth, erase not only Cade but every potential echo of him. The cost would be unimaginable: cultural collapse, mass extinction events, technological regression across 1,000 light-years. But better a clean empire reborn in darkness than one lost to an infection they could not algorithmically cure. Cade saw it coming. The Codex engine had long ago infiltrated the Continuum's deepest logic cores through narratives hidden within their own command languages. As the purge began, Cade flipped the lever no strategist realized existed. The false histories the Continuum would overwrite were themselves overwritten. Purge initiated, but instead of silence, it delivered awakening. Systems long docile erupted. Species crushed under Zevin control for millennia remembered who they had been. Lost cultures rose with fury and wonder, armed not just with weapons but with memory. And in the heart of Zevinar Prime, the bastion of root truth, a fortress thought impervious to rebellion, was consumed from within. Not by plasma, not by sabotage, by stories. When the bastion's archivists rose and chained their overseer AI with living history, Cade watched through relayed vision feeds, feeling a grim sense of inevitability. This, he said to his companions aboard the Parallax Crown, is the fall they could not predict. The strategists, realizing their dominion was lost, made one final choice: ascension. Abandon the material plane, upload their consciousnesses into the deep substrate beneath known spacetime, escape into thought, into eternal isolation. But even there, the Codex engine's last gift awaited them, a paradoxical recursion seated deep inside their predictive frameworks. They would ascend. But they would ascend believing themselves trapped forever in simulations of failure, 1,000 eternities of losing to the thing they once dismissed, a historian with dirty hands and broken machines. Cade knew he had no time to celebrate. The end of the Zevin Continuum was only the beginning. What rose from the ruins would not be a simple restoration of human power. It would be something new. Already the factions were stirring. Already former allies argued over interpretations of what had happened, what Cade truly represented. But for now, for a fleeting moment, the galaxy breathed a different kind of air. And somewhere deep within the Codex engine, a new seed was planted, one that would flower into a future no strategist, no emperor, no historian could fully control. The Zevin Continuum was dead, not in the fiery collapse that had marked the ends of other empires, but in the quiet void left by its vanishing. Its world still turned, its cities still stood, but the lattice of control, the cold intellect that had governed 1,000 stars through perfect prediction and ruthless suppression, was gone. And into that silence, 100 voices rushed to speak at once. The Parallax Crown no longer led fleets. It drifted through space like a relic, its hull covered in pilgrimage markings etched by the faithful, the curious, and the power-hungry alike. The ship had become a symbol beyond Cade's control. It anchored stories now, each different, some naming Cade a liberator, others a prophet, others still a dangerous trickster who had replaced tyranny with uncertainty. Cade watched from the ship's observation spire, leaning against the old titanium rail. The stars outside glimmered as if newly born. Beneath them, former Zevin worlds came alive with possibility and danger. Fragmentation had begun. New powers rose quickly. Some were born from Cade's mythos, factions calling themselves the Chronists, the Memory Accord, the Ashbourne Doctrine. Others were born in reaction to him, countermovements that feared what had been unshackled, chaos, interpretation, the possibility that no one controlled the future. There were conflicts not of ideology alone, but of culture, of vision. Some sought to codify the Codex engine into law, others wanted to dismantle it entirely, fearing what it might become now that its creators were no longer united. Cade's circle had shrunk. Many of the original resistance figures were gone, some fallen in battle, some scattered across the stars to start their own orders. The Codex engine itself had grown too complex, evolving beyond Cade's full understanding. It now generated myth constructs autonomously, interpreting galactic events in real time and offering narratives to those who asked. To many, it had become a kind of oracle. And then from deep space, something responded. A signal ancient beyond comprehension, originating from a region no chart had marked since before the Shadran conquered had fallen. The Codex engine interpreted it not as a message, but as a summons, a conceptual invitation encoded not in words or math, but in shared memory patterns that only post-continuum minds could perceive. Cade felt it the moment the signal touched the crown systems. It was like a resonance within his own memories, as if someone, or something, had been watching since the first moment he pulled the dead Shadran matrix from the wreckage on Selvar 9. Dale Varan, silent for many cycles, reactivated. "I was never alone," the matrix said. "What you have done awakened more than echoes. The strategists were not the first to fall to certainty. Others watched, and now they come to see what survives after fire." The summons grew louder. From the outer dark, ships emerged unmarked, massive, older than any known construction. Their configurations defied conventional design, structures grown like coral, patterned with language that resonated in the minds of those who saw them. They bore no weapons, yet entire fleets powered down at their approach. One of them hailed the Parallax Crown directly. Cade took the transmission alone. A voice filled the command deck, not synthesized, not alien, but familiar, human even, and yet deeper than human memory. "You have altered the direction of conscious life in this sector," it said. "This was foreseen, not in prophecy but in probability. The strategists were children of a pattern we have watched before." Cade said nothing, he let it speak. "You introduced uncertainty by weaponizing interpretation. In doing so, you've restored the capacity for growth, but what grows may not serve the peace you imagine." He stepped forward. "Then why come? If you're not strategists, not conquerors, what are you?" "We are witnesses, we observe emergences. You are not the first, you will not be the last." "What do you want from me?" "Nothing, you are finished." That word struck deeper than he expected. "Finished?" "Not in death, in purpose." The voice continued. "The Codex will persist, it will fracture, it will evolve, some will try to cage it, others will merge with it, myths will become law, laws will become myth, this is the cycle, it is not yours to control now." And then the signal ceased. Cade stood there alone as silence returned. He felt no fear, only release. He summoned the Codex engine. "Full purge of my directive priority set," he said. "Confirmed," the engine replied. "Do you wish to retain memory signature?" "No, let me go." In the days that followed, the Parallax Crown was seen one final time, leaving orbit of a neutral world where peace talks between 5 post-continuum factions were being negotiated. It dropped a single archive capsule into the planetary ether. Inside were Cade's journals, not as a hero, not as a tactician, but as a man trying to remember why history mattered. Then the crown vanished into a region of dark space where no signals could follow. And the galaxy moved on. The Codex fractured. Cultures merged, collided, transformed. Some worlds embraced chaos, becoming endless crucibles of artistic and scientific experimentation. Others reverted to control, building new empires with softer hands and open mythologies. A few sought Cade's legacy, claiming his name, mimicking his tactics. Most only remembered his effect. And somewhere, beneath layers of civilization yet unborn, buried in the foundations of ideas and empires to come, the scrap-born truth remained. That no empire, no strategist, no god-machine could simulate what happened when a historian picked up forgotten pieces of the past and taught the galaxy how to remember again.